Queensland's Barrier Reef has long been a battleground between environmentalists on one side and developers on the other. Now it's entering yet another chapter. Environmentalists claim the reef is now under threat from a dredging program to create the world's biggest coal port on the North Queensland coast. But industry groups say the activists are increasingly hysterical and that the port will revive the resources sector and help boost tourism. The Federal Environment Minister promises that strict protections are in place, but the row is certain to continue, as Peter McCutcheon reports.
It
is already one of Australia's most significant industrial sites.
Abbott Point is a very suitable deep-water port.
This is a World Heritage Area. It's not a highway for coal and gas ships.
It's the federal government's biggest environmental decision so far, giving the green light to more than 3 million cubic metres of dredge waste being dumped inside the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park.
It is now emerging as Queensland's next major industrial development hub.
It's a welcome move for the resources sector, allowing a massive port expansion at Abbott Point in North Queensland to service new coal developments in the Galilee Basin, hundreds of kilometres inland.
It's another step along the way towards getting the financial go-ahead for these large mining projects.
But this port expansion is coming under extraordinary environmental scrutiny at a time UNESCO's World Heritage listing of this Australian icon is under review.
It's almost like the Abbott government is daring the UN to downgrade the status of the reef. These are very high stakes.
The Great Barrier Reef is struggling. Coral cover is at an historical low due to cyclones, agricultural runoff and outbreaks of the dreaded crown of thorns starfish. But it's port developments along the reef coastline that have caught the attention of UNESCO's World Heritage Committee.
The committee has expressed extreme concern about the industrialisation of the reef coast in the past, and they've provided the government with a number of recommendations to improve their management.
Those recommendations included an effective moratorium on new port developments. And if Australia doesn't satisfy the World Heritage Committee, it runs the risk of the reef being listed as in danger, with serious consequences for the multi-billion-dollar tourist industry. So the Abbott Point project, turning this port into potentially one of the biggest coal terminals in the world, comes at a sensitive time.
It's the issue of industrialisation absolutely is front and centre of their minds when they think about the Great Barrier Reef. And given that this is the first major decision that Minister Hunt has considered with regards to the Great Barrier Reef, he really has failed at that first test.
But the Minister says he's confident his decision will pass World Heritage scrutiny, arguing he's considerably scaled back proposals put forward under the previous Labor government and imposed strict conditions.
These are dramatic and some would say far tougher than necessary conditions. I take responsibility for those.
But the critical issue here is why the dredging waste should be allowed to be dumped inside the marine park.
All of the scientific advice I've received is that not only will that have a minimal outcome, a minimal impact, but in fact we will have improved water quality with the toughest conditions for the net benefit Australia's ever had.
Environment groups say there were other options, a longer jetty or disposing of the material inland. The resources industry argues these proposals either had environmental problems of their own or simply cost too much. At a time Australia's management of the Great Barrier Reef is under increasing scrutiny, do you agree it's not a good look to have material dumped inside the marine park?
Oh, well, if there was another option, then that would be good. But in this case, and port by port, you have to look at what's available.
One unresolved problem for the dredging program is exactly where the material will be dumped. The original disposal point, although well away from coral, was near a World War II plane wreck that the local divers and the RSL wanted preserved. And although the Port Authority has since identified alternative sites, no final decision has been made.
How can they approve something when they don't know where it's going to occur? It's like asking for the development application for a building to be approved when you don't have a location for the building.
The battle over Abbott Point dredging has been going on for nearly 5 years. And the final chapter is a crucial decision on the actual disposal site. That's now in the hands of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, which in theory could even deny a dumping permit.
And they need to make a decision that is protective of the reef and puts the reef before the profits of the big mining companies.
It's completely a matter for them. They will act independently, as they should.
Peter McCutcheon with that report.
This is the true force of Cyclone Anthony as it crosses the town of Bowen. The winds here are clocking speeds well over 130 kilometres an hour, and with it is bringing buckets of rain. In the last 20 minutes, the Bureau says it's dumped 130 millimetres in and around the town, causing localised flooding on the roads and around people's houses. People are told to stay home and stay off the road. The only people we see driving around are emergency services and police. This is only just the start for Bowen. The next cyclone, Cyclone Yassi, which is expected to cross in the coming days, is expected to be much worse, a Category 4 or a Category 5. Cyclone Anthony crosses a Category 2, and already you can see the wind and the rain that it's brought. Signs are barely standing up, trees are being bent, and this cyclone itself is a warning of what Yassi can be.
And now he and Greg Hunt have contributed to the deterioration of the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is dying, and Tony Abbott is hastening its death. By deciding to approve the Abbott Point dredging and dumping into the waters around the Great Barrier Reef, Tony Abbott has made it clear that he puts industrialising the reef, giving approvals to coal mines and gas facilities for his big business mates, is a much greater priority for him than protecting the reef and the 63,000 jobs that depend on it. I visited the Great Barrier Reef during the recent election campaign, and at the Whitsundays met with some of the tourism operators who have their businesses dependent on the pristine waters of the reef. And they made it clear to me that the mining industry is just taking over the Queensland coast. The mining industry is now funding the tourism organisations. The mining industry will see the end of the reef. With both accelerated global warming, ocean acidification, and now the dumping of sludge into the reef, and it can travel up to 80 kilometres. So any suggestion that this will be controlled by the Queensland government or by any conditions is an utter and complete nonsense. This is the death knell for the Great Barrier Reef, turning it into a coal highway, filling it with sludge, is unacceptable to the whole country. It is a blow to our self-definition. The Great Barrier Reef is an icon. Australians love it, and we're not going to stand by and see it destroyed. My colleague Larissa Waters will just add a few details.
Thanks, Christine. We saw a really sad day for the Great Barrier Reef yesterday when last night our so-called Minister for the Environment approved the world's biggest coal port right inside the Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. He also approved additional development for coal seam gas export in Gladstone Harbour after it's already faced huge environmental damage from the mass dredging, the offshore dumping of that sludge, and of course the increased shipping through the reef. Once again, we've seen the Abbott government is prepared to sacrifice the environment, even the Great Barrier Reef, for the private profits of its big mining buddies. This is an incredibly sad day for the reef, and I know Australians will be as outraged as we are. We know Greg Hunt's office has been flooded with phone calls from all across Australia with people worried about the future of the reef and asking why is he prepared to sacrifice its beauty, its biodiversity and the 63,000 people who rely on it for a job just to make a few foreign mining companies even richer. They can't understand it, and neither can we. Now, this comes amongst a really sad week for the environment. We saw on Monday Minister Hunt weakened protection for threatened species when he allowed the Minister himself and the previous one to ignore expert advice about threatened species. Of course, today they're moving to remove protection for the Murray-Darling Basin and its precious wetlands. On Friday, they're wanting to give away even more of their environmental responsibilities to state governments because they don't want those responsibilities anymore. They don't actually want to be bothered with protecting the environment. They're too busy selling it out to the big miners. So sadly, we see yesterday's reef decision nestled amongst a terrible week for the environment, and this is more of what we can expect from the Abbott government. Greg Hunt is sadly now the Minister against the environment.
Greg Hunt says that these projects will be subject to the strictest environmental conditions in Australian history. Is he wrong?
Look, sadly I have no confidence that the conditions that Mr Hunt has imposed will either be complied with or enforced or work. You cannot dredge 3 million cubic metres of seabed from a World Heritage Area, dump that offshore where it can move and smother corals and seagrasses and fishing beds and get into the gills of wildlife. You cannot dump that much sludge in World Heritage waters without having an effect. And what's more, the Queensland Government and the Federal Government have slashed the staff that are responsible to enforce those conditions. So we know, and industry knows, that those conditions are written on a piece of paper but will probably stay in somebody's top drawer, won't be enforced, won't be monitored, and they know they can get away with blue murder. Now there's a spurious condition that the Minister has included about asking farmers to do even more to avoid runoff to the reef. Now the quantum that the Minister is asking the dredgers to try and avoid in order to compensate for them being able to dump offshore is 20 times the amount of sediment that's been saved from the reef in 5 years of 2 governments. So, put another way, we've had a huge effort by the Federal Government, the Queensland Government, farmers to try and reduce runoff. Greg Hunt now thinks that the dredgers will be able to achieve that with the click of their fingers, 20 times that amount. It's not going to work. It's a magic pudding condition that the Minister knows can't be complied with and won't be complied with.
So
the Greens' Larissa Waters, along with leader Christine Milne there, saying the government approval of the Abbott Point coal terminal in Queensland, which will involve dredging and 3 other industrial projects, will spell the death knell for the Great Barrier Reef.